Reading from Srila Prabhupada Leela chapter entitled The Layman and the Blind Man. While maintaining his excellent progress on Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada also got the opportunity in Hawaii to begin another book. His longtime disciple and editor Hayagriva wrote, asking to assist Srila Prabhupada in a series of interview commentaries on the Western philosophers. This was the same project Prabhupada had begun with his former secretary Shyama Sundara, but when Shyama Sundara had abandoned his duties in ISKCON, he had also misplaced the tapes and transcripts of the considerable work they had done together. Hayagriva proposed to start again, beginning with Socrates and Plato. The process would be that Hayagriva would present before Prabhupada a summary of a particular Western thinker's philosophy. Prabhupada would then respond extemporaneously, giving appreciation and criticism of the philosopher according to the Vedic viewpoint. Prabhupada and his disciples had been enthusiastic about the interviews done in former years, and Prabhupada had even titled the series Dialectical Spiritualism. But when Shyama Sundara had misplaced the tapes, the project had dissipated. Now Hayagriva, the former college English professor and original editor for Bhakti Godhead in America, asked to be allowed to come to Hawaii for reviving the philosophy book and for spending time with Prabhupada. Like various other disciples, Hayagriva had given up strictly following the regulative principles. Srila Prabhupada had come to tolerate the reality that some disciples, even after taking vows of initiation, would be unable to resist the strong pull of the senses and would give up the path of active devotional service in ISKCON. In the early years, he and his followers had reacted with great shock whenever a devotee had gone away. But with time, as the unfortunate event had continued to occur, sometimes even striking down leading trusted disciples, Prabhupada had grown to live with it. But he never stopped feeling bereaved over a lost son or daughter, especially if that disciple had rendered him significant service, and he never withheld his affection from them or his open, loving invitation for them to return. Such a case was Hayagriva, a dear son who had come to Srila Prabhupada during the summer of 1966 in New York. He had given valuable service, but had eventually been unable to follow the simple but strict principles of Krishna consciousness. Now, after suffering the vicissitudes of material life, he had gathered his resolve to come back to his beloved spiritual master. Hayagriva entered Prabhupada's room. "It's your old Hayagriva, Prabhupada," he said, and he fell to the floor sobbing. Prabhupada gave him a garland and asked him how he and his family were doing. Then, in the presence of the other devotees, Prabhupada related how Hayagriva had been sent by Krishna to help him spread the Krishna consciousness movement all over the world. When Hayagriva said he had never forgotten Prabhupada even for a day, Prabhupada replied, "And I also never forgot you. I was thinking, has Hayagriva gone away? I was thinking like that." Prabhupada's voice broke, his eyes filled with tears, and he could not speak. Finally, he asked everyone to leave the room. Prabhupada and Hayagriva began meeting daily, sometimes for as long as 2 or 3 hours. Dialectical spiritualism was again underway, moving side by side with the 8th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, and Hayagriva was again in his original position at Srila Prabhupada's lotus feet. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Prabhupada must have spent more time on that one book in terms of the size of the book than in any of his books. Because like if you read how much time he spent with Shyama Sundar on that book, it was like every day for months. And so it's a lot of energy and potency. So we're reading Srimad Bhagavatam, 5th canto, chapter 10, text 24. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Tan me bhavan Nara Deva Bhimana. Tan me bhavan Nara Deva Bhimana. Tan me bhavan Nara Deva Bhimana. Madena Tachikrita Satamasya. Madena Tachikrita Satamasya. Madena Tachikrita Satamasya. Krisishta Maitri Trisham Arta Bando. Krishishta Maitri Trisham Arta Bando. Krishishta Maitri Trisham Arta Bando. Yata Tare Sat Avadyanam Angha. Yata Tare Sat Avadyanam Angha. Yata Tare Sat Avadyanam Angha. Tanme bhavan Nara Deva Bhimana. Madena Chuchi Kriti Sattamasya Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha
Tanme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Shishta Maitri Drisham Artabando
Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando
Yatatare Sadavadhyanamamha
Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha
Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Krishishta Maitri Drishamartabando
Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando
Yatatare Sadavadhyanamamha
Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha Vaishnavis.
Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya
Shishta Maitri Drisham Artabando
Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando
Yadhatare Sadavadhyanamamha
Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha Tamme Bhavannara Deva Vimana Madena Tuchi Krita Sattamasya Krishishta Maitri Drisham Artavando Yatatare Sad Avadhyanamamha Tat. Therefore, may unto me Bhavan, your good self, Nara Deva Abhimana Madena, by madness due to having the body of a king, and thus being proud of it, Tuchikrita, who has insulted, Sattamasya, you who are the best among human beings, Krishishta, kindly show, Maitri Drisham, your causeless mercy upon me like a friend, Artabando, O friend of all distressed persons, Yata, so, Tare, I can get relief from, Sat Avadhyanam, neglecting a great personality like you, Angha, the sin. Translation. Whatever you have spoken appears to me to be contradictory. O best friend of the distressed, I have committed a great offense by insulting you. I was puffed up with false prestige due to possessing the body of a king. For this I have certainly become an offender. Therefore I pray that you kindly glance at me with your causeless mercy. If you do so, I can be relieved from sinful activities brought about by insulting you. Please repeat. Whatever you have spoken appears to me to be contradictory. O best friend of the distressed, I have committed a great offense by insulting you. I was puffed up with false prestige due to possessing the body of a king.
due to possessing the body of a king.
For this I have certainly become an offender.
For this I have certainly become an offender.
Therefore I pray that you kindly glance at me
Therefore I pray that you kindly glance at me
with your causeless mercy.
with your causeless mercy.
If you do so,
If you do so,
I can be relieved from sinful activities
I can be relieved from sinful activities
brought about by insulting you.
brought about by insulting you.
Purport by Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki.
Right.
Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has said that by offending a Vaishnava one finishes all his spiritual activities. Offending a Vaishnava is considered the mad elephant offence. A mad elephant can destroy an entire garden which has been developed with great labour. One may attain the topmost platform of devotional service, but somehow or other, if he offends a Vaishnava, the whole structure collapses. Unconsciously, King Rahugana offended Javat, but due to his good sense, he asked to be excused. This is the process by which one can be relieved from a Vaishnava aparad. Krishna is always very simple, by nature merciful. When one commits an offence at the feet of a Vaishnava, one must immediately apologize to such a personality, so that his spiritual advancement may not be hampered. Amagyanatimandasya Ginanjana Shavakaya Chikshurmanitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkness, ignorance, my spiritual master has forced open my eyes for the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Tapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Shri Prabhupada Sagajatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sabadutam Varijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitam He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopisha Gopaka Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sutadevi Pranamami Piri Priye Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupadhamayam Dadati Swapatantikam Anshikapatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhyevicha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. I offer my respectful obeisances unto all the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord who can fulfill the desires of everyone like Desiatrines, and who are full of compassion for the fallen conditioned souls. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Sarigura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, yeah, Rahash Rahugana, the king here, we don't know very much about his previous life, so you could argue that he was already a great personality, or you could argue that simply by a few moments association with Chad Bharat, a Paramahamsa devotee, then he as we say, Amagyana Timarandasya Gyananjana Shalakya Chakshurumanitanjana Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Certainly his eyes had been opened in some way by the torchlight of knowledge, and he understood that he'd committed a great offence by, as he said, insulting Chad Bharat, and he felt that he'd become an offender. So he knew enough about Krishna consciousness to know that his insulting Chad Bharat had put him in a precarious situation whereby he may lose the favour of the Supreme Lord. So it seems that he was a saintly king who understood his position as eternal servant of the Lord. But as he says, I was puffed up with false prestige due to possessing the body of a king. And also, it's interesting, the first thing he says, whatever you've spoken appears to me to be contradictory. So although the king is saying, I don't really understand what you're saying, he concludes from the fact, that he can't understand what Javat is saying, he concludes that his knowledge is very small, very meagre. The fact that I can't understand what you're saying indicates that I'm not really qualified to pass comment on you. I'm certainly not qualified to criticize you. So he recognized the qualities of Javat, not based so much on what he said. He said, I can't really understand what you're saying. But he recognized in some way, he recognized the character of Javat. When Javat spoke, he could perceive the purity of Javat when Javat spoke. So this is very rare. It's very rare actually in society today that someone who's actually respected for their position in society, like a politician or a king or a business leader or an academic leader, if such a person has like an unusual encounter with someone and they can't, if they think that somebody is speaking contradictory words, then their first response is to criticize that person. Their first response is to actually think, here's an opportunity to exercise my superiority. Here's an opportunity for me to present my agenda by demeaning this person, because I don't understand what they say. And if I don't understand what they say, that must mean that what they're saying is wrong. So this is a very good lesson. Even though we may have a lot of knowledge and understanding of many topics, there are definitely some topics that we don't have an understanding of. And by nature, we have the tendency to make mistakes, to be illusioned. We have imperfect senses, and we have the tendency to cheat. So here, Maharaj Mahugira is not displaying the cheating propensity. He's acknowledging that his senses are imperfect. He's acknowledging that he's got a tendency to be illusioned. He's acknowledging that he's made a mistake. But at least he's not cheating. At least he's not saying, well, I've made a mistake and my senses are imperfect, but, after all, I'm the king, so, move aside, Javat. No, he actually at least had the humility to acknowledge that that he'd made a mistake. And because of that, then he became the recipient of great mercy, wonderful mercy. Like in the next 2 chapters, he's hearing transcendental instructions and transcendental words from the mouth of Javat. So I was thinking that, and how this relates to my own life, in one sense. For certain reasons, throughout my life, I've actually never really gravitated towards certain aspects of gross sense gratification, especially like attraction to the opposite sex. It's actually due to my biology. I've got like an unusual chromosome in my body, an unusual chromosome. It's actually XXY. As far as I understand, because of that, I'm not actually visually attracted to the opposite sex. So a large amount of my life like I was saved, you could say. I was saved from spending years and years and years looking for a partner, looking for a mate. But instead, I made a partner with my mind. I made a partner with my mind. And so I would have, rather than chatting up the ladies, I'd be chatting up the different kind of philosophies that my mind would present to me. And like when I was a child, when all the kids were bringing toys, like after Christmas, our school teacher, I remember when we were like first year of secondary school, when we were 11 years old, I think perhaps it was just to kind of like allow the young children moving into primary into secondary school. They were allowed to bring their toys into school after Christmas, and like when we were 11. So they were all bringing in their toys and their action men, and their camp games, their board games and Risk and all of their kind of Meccano sets, and like model aeroplanes and cars. And I came in with like in dictionaries and atlases and like a whole stack of books like this. So I've been actually courting my mind, from a very, very early age. Actually, probably the earliest I can remember is when I was about 5 years old. I remember I would actually spend many nights kind of losing sleep, thinking about why bad things happen in the world, and just, so therefore I've got like a general tendency to think that I know more than everybody else about almost everything. But by the mercy of the devotees, especially the devotees who I first met actually when I went to Bhaktivedanta Manor, actually I remember the devotee in particular was a devotee called Satchinandana. So he also called Satchi Sutra as well. Is that the same devotee?
We just called him Sachi.
Yeah, he was like.
What's his name?
So he was like the ashram leader at the manor. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So I remember actually the first time I went to the manor, which was 1987. Then I'd been invited by Bhagavad Dharma, who actually I knew from Newcastle, and it was very nice. I'd come from a conference, a Quaker conference in Birmingham, and I got frustrated there because I was trying to cook a meal, and people were saying, you can't use those dates. Those dates came from Iraq. Did not know that the Iraqis are using chemical weapons. And then other people were saying I couldn't use this ingredient in the meal and that ingredient in the meal. And so I just thought, okay, I'm just going to go. I thought Bhagavad Dharma had previously invited me, so I thought, okay, I'm just going to go to the Bhaktivedanta Manor and see Bhagavad Dharma. And when I got there, then he immediately engaged me in some service. Actually, he engaged me in getting all together all of the newspaper articles that had been printed in the last few days and putting them up on the notice board at the manor. And then I stayed in the evening, and then in the morning there was a class, and Satchi Sutra Prabhu, and then so I remember sort of coming up with some arguments. I can't remember what it was actually now, what the argument was. But he just said, okay, that's fine. You can think like that if you like. But he said, but here in this community, this is like something you'll not experience anywhere else in the whole of like intellectual society. These are the only people who actually have a different way of looking at things, and it's based on, Krishna's mercy. It's based on like real deep introspection. So he said, it's up to you. You can go if you like. No one's going to keep you here. So I kind of something about his mood he didn't have any arguments. He didn't attempt to like enter into any kind of philosophical discussion with me. He just basically said, yeah, he said, your perspective is reasonable, you know, the argument is reasonable, but he said, you won't actually progress, you'll not be able to progress in life from that platform. So I had him to thank, actually, for, that was like a real, I guess it's a very, very gentle way to kind of like destroy my ego. So it was nice. I saw him actually on about the last time I was in London. He was on Harinam. Yeah. That's right. And so I was actually last week when I was in the garden, I was listening to Chaitanya Charitamrita. I was listening to the pastime which we're reading now on a Sunday, but it just kind of went on for a few more, a little bit longer, and I came across a really interesting purport which is about 5 pages long, and in it, Srila Prabhupada describes all of the different philosophers and politicians and scientists. He mentions Kapila, Vasishta, Duvasa. He mentions Hiranyakashipu, Ravan, Jarasandha. And he mentions Charles Darwin. And he mentions Putana, Trinavata. He mentions Charvaka Muni, King Vena, Arhat. Arhat was the person who founded Jainism. And he mentions Patanjali Muni. So he basically says that all of these philosophers, they're accepted as Mahajans in society at various times. It is those who are devoid of devotional service who sometimes mistakenly accept persons with mundane motives as Mahajans. The only motive must be Krishna Bhakti, devotional service to the Lord. Sometimes fruitive workers, dry philosophers, non-devotees, mystic yogis, and persons attached to material opulence, women and money are considered Mahajans. But Srimad Bhagavatam gives the following statement about such unauthorized Mahajans. Prayena Veda Tadidam Na Mahajanoyam Devya Vimohita Matiya Vatamaya Yalam Trayam Jari Kritamati Madim Pushpatayam Vaitanike Mahiti Kamani Yujyamana. In this material world, fruitive actors are accepted as Mahajans by foolish people who do not know the value of devotional service. The mundane intelligence and mental speculative methods of such foolish people are under the control of the 3 modes of material nature. Consequently, they cannot understand unalloyed devotional service. So, in the song, later in this purport, it's a really amazing purport. It's Madhya Lila chapter 17, verse 185. So Srila Prabhupada quotes Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Mitri Mayaravashe Yajyabe Shikatre Ha Budubai Jiva Krishna Dase Vishvas Kalita Ara Dukanai. Don't be carried away by the waves of Maya. Just surrender to the lotus feet of Krishna and all miseries will end. Those who follow social customs and behavior forget to follow the path chalked out by the Mahajans. Thus they are offenders at the lotus feet of the Mahajans. Sometimes they consider such Mahajans very conservative, or they create their own Mahajans. In this way they ignore the principles of the Parampara system. So this is often the case, that persons who think that they're very liberal, that they're very aware of the way the world runs, they think that they've sussed it all out. They're not foolish. They're not brainwashed by the status quo or by the vested interests. They can understand they can understand the political theory of everything. So, but those persons, they have a tendency to see spiritually advanced teachers as being right-wing or conservative, and they criticize them, and they become, because of that criticism, and they lose the opportunity to actually come to a much higher understanding. And they condemn themselves to a life of eternal conflict and polarization, where they're always seeing the conservatives as the enemy, or the conservatives are seeing the radicals as the enemy. And this conflict's been going on for millions of years, or hundreds of, it's been going on eternally. And that actually when we give up our relationship with the Mahajans, when we give up our relationship with the gentle-hearted, pure, self-realized souls, then due to losing that deep relationship, then we're forced to attach ourselves to some ism, so whether it's like fascism or socialism or Extinction Rebellion or veganism. So we become attached to some group of people whose motives may be very good, but who have an inability to understand the higher principle, the higher spiritual principle. So to protect ourselves from this, then we need to seek out the association of persons who are broad-minded. What's the name of a broad-minded person again? Exactly, Mahatma. Not cripple-minded. What's the name? What's a cripple-minded? Javat. Actually, it's interesting. I know some of us here listen to The Wisdom of the Sages, which is a nice daily podcast by Raghunath and Kaush Kuba. And yesterday, Raghunath was talking about how when he was a very young devotee, the first time he went to Vrindavan, then his guru at that time, Damodar Swami, he wasn't an initiate, but his mentor, said, "Now you're in Vrindavan now. This is the place of service." And so Raghunath said, "Oh yes, give me some service. Let me do something. Can I serve the devotees prasadam?" So he didn't know what he was letting himself in for. And then Damodar Swami said, "Yes, that's very nice. You want to do that. So you can, while you're here for 2 weeks, every day you can serve all of the devotees," which is probably like 100 or 200 devotees. And Raghunath said, it wasn't called Raghunath then at that time, Ray said, "Oh well, do the servers keep something behind for themselves so that they get something at the end?" And Damodar Swami said, "Yeah, sometimes," but he said, but to protect ourselves for the whole of our service here, let's take a vow that we will not expect to eat anything at the end of serving. Let's take a vow that we'll be very pleased to serve out all of the prasadam to all of the guests, and we'll just never think about having any ourselves." Raghunath actually, Ray, he said that was a wonderful experience, and he said he wouldn't have been able to do that. He wouldn't have been able to control his mind if he hadn't taken that vow. So this is the actual benefit of coming in contact with a very experienced, self-realized person who understands the pushings of the material modes of nature. Just last night I was getting caught up a bit in my speculation and dry philosophy, and I felt I needed to connect with the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and I opened it up at probably my favourite verse I mean, it probably opens at that page because I often open it at that page. You know, so, but anyway, although I've read this verse many, many times and it is my favourite, it never really struck me in this way before. It's Adi Lila chapter 2, verse 2. And it's a very, very beautiful verse. The Sanskrit is Krishna Kirtana Gananatana Kala Kato Janni Brajita Sadbhakta Asang Chakra Madhupa Srini Viharaspadam Kananandi Kaladrini Vahatume Jiva Maruprangane Sri Chaitanya Dayani Ditavala Salila Shuddha O my merciful Lord Chaitanya, may the nectarian Ganges waters of your transcendental activities flow on the surface of my desert-like tongue. Beautifying these waters are the lotus flowers of singing, dancing, and loud chanting of Krishna's holy name, which are the pleasure abodes of unalloyed devotees. These devotees are compared to swans, ducks, and bees. The river's flowing produces a melodious sound that gladdens their ears. And in the purport, I mean, the whole purport is amazing actually, but anyway, this is like, our tongue is always engaged in vibrating useless sounds that do not help us realize transcendental peace. So I've been reading like stuff about climate change for about an hour at this time. I wasn't reading it out aloud, but it was definitely vibrating in my brain anyway. The tongue is compared to a desert because a desert needs a constant supply of refreshing water to make it fertile and fruitful. Water is the substance most needed in the desert. The transient pleasure derived from mundane topics of art, culture, politics, sociology, dry philosophy, poetry, and so on is compared to a mere drop of water, because although such topics have a qualitative feature of transcendental pleasure, they are saturated with the modes of material nature. Therefore, neither collectively nor individually can they satisfy the vast requirements of the desert-like tongue. Despite crying in various conferences, so that just hit me. I thought, my God, it's amazing. I've just been reading about the COP26 Conference of Parties, United Nations Foundation for Climate Change Combating, and it just hit me there. Despite crying in various conferences, therefore, the desert-like tongue continues to be parched. For this reason, people from all parts of the world must call for the devotees of Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who are compared to swans swimming around the beautiful lotus feet of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, or bees humming around his feet in transcendental pleasure, searching for honey. The dryness of material happiness cannot be moistened by so-called philosophers who cry for Brahman, liberation, and similar dry speculative objects. The urge of the soul proper is different. The soul can be solaced only by the mercy of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his many bona fide devotees who never leave the lotus feet of the Lord to become imitation Mahaprabhus, but all cling to his lotus feet like bees that never leave a honey-soaked lotus flower. I mean, it might have been a bit too devastating for me this if Srila Prabhupada hadn't said that the transient pleasure derived from mundane topics of art, culture, politics, sociology, dry philosophy, poetry, and so on is compared to a mere drop of water, because although such topics have a qualitative feature of transcendental pleasure, they are saturated with the modes of material nature. So it's nice that Srila Prabhupada explains there why we're attracted to them. That because in the spiritual world, then the devotees are engaged in discussions, arguments even about how to serve Krishna best. They're engaged in poetry and music and art and culture. So there's a qualitative feature of transcendental pleasure. But in the material world, they're contaminated by the modes of material nature. So Yeah, so we really need, just like Toksha was saying yesterday, if we want some me time to like read things that kind of churn our intellect, then we need to protect ourselves by putting first of all the chanting of the holy name and hearing the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya and remembering the deities and remembering the good fortune that we have to be in the association of Mahajans, of Mahatmas. Actually Mahatma Prabhu, like he's a person Mahatma Prabhu, who we have listened to his podcasts and his Zoom calls, so he has a lot of knowledge of these areas of culture, politics, sociology, philosophy, etc. And but because he's very strict in his sadhana, and because he's also very much trying to please Srila Prabhupada by extending Lord Chaitanya's mercy to the fallen conditioned souls, then when he talks in these terms, then he's able to use them as a means to communicate that mercy of Srila Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya. So if we have an attraction for these things, then we can engage that attachment. But if we neglect our sadhana, then we risk becoming offenders, or we risk becoming cripple-minded. We're actually crippling ourselves or shooting ourselves in the foot by neglecting our sadhana. So thank you to the devotees at Krunabhavan for putting up with me for so long and allowing me to continue. And I'm very much like reading Chaitanya Charitamrita. I find it actually it's very, very satisfying on all levels. A very wonderful book. So I recommend anyone who enjoys reading things which are intellectually stimulating and to read Chaitanya Charitamrita. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions or comments, corrections? Is there anything online? Kranchara Sri Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Shri Shri Kodamata Gosha Shiki, Nitai Gaur Purnami.